Okay, let's do this. All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about internal and external strategies. Okay, so I'm just going to say that, I'm just going to put that out there. I will explain what I mean by that in just a moment. And that's just a term that I'm using. There could be other terms. In fact, I'm going to talk about some other terms that other people have used before, but I'm going to explain what I mean. So I have been out of the Army for about 2.5 years. And if you've ever heard any of the interviews that I've given or things that I've written since then, where I explain why I left the Army, I give a couple of reasons. I would say, I could no longer reconcile continued service in the Army, this institution that was thoroughly corrupt, and still feel like I was making good on the oath to the Constitution that I had taken. I thought I was actually going to have to take off the uniform in order to make good on that oath. I would say things like that. I still very much feel that way. My mind has not changed at all in that regard. But what I kind of want to talk about today, and I'm just using myself as an example, this is much bigger than just me, but I'm just going to explain some of my thoughts on this. But I would say I felt I needed to leave the Army and that I could actually do more good, even more good for the Army by leaving. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And, why did I feel that way? Because if people ask me about this, and sometimes they would in interviews, I would say, hey, listen, that's a decision that I made. That's a decision that I felt was consistent with my worldview, with my view of the Army or the military as a whole, or the United States government at this point in time. And I also was more consistent with my worldview, but also was more effective for me. This is a decision that I made. And I don't necessarily make any judgment on other people who made other decisions. There are many people who feel similar to me. And for whatever reason, they have decided to remain inside the military and kind of, fight from within. And that's kind of what I want to get at today, though this is much bigger than just the military. I'm just kind of giving an example. But I want to talk about these internal versus external strategies and what the difference is and how maybe we can kind of understand why others view things or perhaps operate a little bit differently than we do, depending on their perspective and where they're at and the strategy that they may be employing, even if they're not necessarily aware of why their strategy is different than yours or why yours is different than theirs. So recently, I heard Catherine Austin Fitts, and I'm assuming that many of you know who she is, use the term inside and outside games, and I knew exactly what she meant because I've been kicking this idea around, like I said, for probably 2.5 years. And so she used inside versus outside games. And she was, if I remember correctly, and it doesn't matter if I'm not because this isn't exactly my point, she was referring to the um, confirmation hearings for Bobby Kennedy Jr., of course, to be the secretary of HHS. Now, we know now he's in the position, et cetera. But at the time that she made the comment, she was just referring to the hearings. And she, if I remember correctly, but if I'm misremembering this, this is not the point anyway. But she said, and she was remarking about some of the comments that he made in his confirmation hearings that a lot of people got really upset about. And she said, hey, people are confusing inside and outside games. They don't realize that he's playing an inside game. Now, let's pause right there. So first of all, I'm not trying to put words in her mouth. That comment was made several months ago. I'm not trying to say how she feels about what Bobby Kennedy did or did not say during his confirmation hearings. And I'm certainly not making I'm not trying to put words into her mouth as to what she may or may not think now with respect to Bobby Kennedy's more recent comments that have angered a lot of people. And I'm not making a comment on that. That is not what I'm here to talk about. My point is understanding what she calls inside or outside games, or what I'm referring to, which I think is pretty much the same thing that she's referring to, inside or outside strategies or internal versus external strategies. Now, I prefer the word strategy to games because to me, that's kind of what we're talking about. And when I say strategy, and I'll do another video at some point and we'll talk more specifically about what strategy is and isn't. But I realize that most people at least have an idea of what the word means, again, not necessarily in some sort of militarily specific way, some sort of like specific military jargon or whatever, but just in the common vernacular. Okay. So when I say here the word strategy, I mean it largely as it's commonly understood. Okay. Just what I would call a plan of action within a given environment to achieve a set of objectives. Okay. A strategy is not just a goal, it's a goal or set of goals with a plan to achieve those goals that are carried out within a given environment. And it's important to understand that strategy is executed within a given environment, which means part of having a cogent strategy is understanding the environment that you're operating in, understanding the different variables that are inherent to that environment. It's also, it means to understand the interlocutors that you may be interacting with in that environment, the types of information and the sources of information given that environment, and all these other variables and the interactions between these variables. And so that's why I use the term inside and outside strategies, and strategies is in the plural. So first of all, I use the word strategy because I do think there's a strategy there, or there should be. But also I use the word in the plural because in my mind, I'm drawing a distinction between these different environments. And therefore, what I'm saying is the strategies, they got to be a little bit different. They have to be different depending on where your perspective is, whether you're inside or outside the system. And we're going to talk more about that. Because someone could say to me, hey, you have a strategy that's comprehensive enough that it has components that are inside the system and other components that are outside the system. And I think, yeah, you could. And in fact, that might even be um, optimal, but we're not there. And at least today, just here right now, this doesn't have to be super formal. I'm just using strategies in the plural to draw a distinction between a strategy that might be employed if you are within a given system and a strategy that you might employ if you are outside that same system. And so that's what I mean by internal or external strategies or inside or outside strategies, whatever. So even as I say that, I have to realize there's not always a hard line between what you would do if you're within a given system and what you would do if you were outside that system. Because a lot of what you would do would be the same, or it would look largely the same, but there will be some differences. Now, somebody might say, well, do you have to be inside or outside? Could you be on the fringes of a system? And I think that's a great question. Because I think, yeah, you could be. I also think that you could be within a certain organization, but not be in the inner core or almost like the system within a system of that organization. So sometimes it can be hard to define as to whether or not you're inside or outside, you know? But whatever, we don't have to get lost in the minutiae. So could you employ elements of both of these strategies? Maybe, maybe not. If you're inside, could you use some outside strategies? Perhaps. If you're outside, could you use some inside strategies? Perhaps. But let's set that aside. Okay, let's just talk about each of these, just assuming that if you're inside, you're using inside strategies. If you're outside, you're using outside strategies. And the first thing we need to understand is it's not, we're not placing a value judgment on whether or not one is better than the other. There may be one that is better for you. There may be one that you feel more aligned with. And I'm not even necessarily talking about because you're inside or because you're outside. I'm talking about if you are making a decision as to whether or not to be inside or outside. There may be one that you feel more closely aligns with what your goals are or what your views are. And so again, we're not placing a value judgment on which is better or whatever. There may be one that is better for you depending on your goals, your views, etc. But both strategies carry opportunities and risks. Let's just talk through a couple of these, right? So first of all, when we're talking about, inside strategy, talking about someone who is internal to the system. Okay. So for me, when I say this system, what am I talking about? So let's just use my example here. I have plenty of friends, former peers that I served with in the military. Many of them are still in the military. Many of them know the problems that exist within the military, and they know that our military is suffering greatly, and they are choosing to kind of fight that fight from within. I'm outside, and we can still be allies in this fight, but the way in which we kind of carry out that fight is a little bit different, right? So they are internal. I'm external. Go back to the Bobby Kennedy. So Bobby Kennedy, now he is inside the administration, right? So one would assume whatever strategy he's trying to employ, if he's trying to employ a strategy, we could quibble over whether or not that's the case. We're not going to go there. But if he is, then he's got to employ a strategy from within that would be different than if he were on the outside. Okay. And we need to understand that and appreciate that. I mean, there's some complexities there that we kind of have to wrap our minds around. Okay. So when we talk about someone who is internal to the system, that could be somebody who is inside the system, understands the flaws of the system, wants to uncover the truth. Someone like that is very overt in their desires. They may be careful, but they still may be very open about what it is they're trying to achieve. But we could also have someone who is more like, almost like carrying out some espionage in the system. Someone who is like an undercover agent, and I'm using that term like metaphorically, but what I'm saying is, someone who is a little bit more covert in disclosing what it is they're trying to do. So this could be someone who doesn't actually support the system, doesn't feel loyal to the system, but has infiltrated the system or was already there within the system and has kind of lost their fealty to the system. But they pretend to still maintain loyalty to the system, even if they've totally lost it or they never had it to begin with. Okay. So you could have the first situation where someone is loyal to the system, but they know its flaws. They know it's bad, and they want reform. They want to change things for the better. They want the truth, but they're still loyal to the system. They care about the system. They care about maybe the goals the system has or whatever. They believe that, the system was created good. It's just been, whatever, twisted over time, whatever. Or you could have somebody who's not loyal to the system at all, that undercover agent that is infiltrated or whatever. Okay. But those are still people that are inside the system, so they may be employing inside strategies to try and meet their goals. Okay. So let's talk about some of the opportunities that they might have as they are employing these inside strategies. Well, one, because they're inside the system, they're closer to the problem. They may have particular insight that they wouldn't necessarily have if they were further removed from the system. I mean, I think that's fair to say. They're closer to the problem. That comes with some advantages. They may also be perceived as a team player. Even the individual who's our undercover agent, if he's well undercover and he's, playing that role. And again, I'm not saying whether this is good or bad or whatever. We're not placing a value judgment on this. We're just trying to explain this. Okay. So these individuals may be perceived as team players, even by those that are more, that don't necessarily care as much about exposing the flaws of the system, or maybe they do, but they don't care as much or whatever. So these are some of the opportunities that people within the system that are carrying out an inside strategy that they might have. They also may have greater access to levers of influence within the system because they're inside it. They may know them. They may have personal relationships with certain individuals who are quite influential or are in positions of power or authority within the system. They may understand who the change agents, formal or informal, are within the system. All of those are opportunities. Those are advantages that can potentially be leveraged by those that are employing an inside strategy. But let's talk about some of the risks. I said that one of the opportunities is, hey, they're closer. Well, there's a risk associated with that too, because there is such a thing as coming too close, right? Which means you may miss the bad that's within the system. You're just too close. You could get too attached to either the system itself, to the organization, the institution that you care about, you're invested in, or you may get too close to the people, maybe some of the people that don't necessarily deserve that kind of leniency or whatever. And when I say you may get too close that you miss things, think about the movies that you've seen, or I don't know, TV shows or whatever, with somebody who is an undercover agent, and now they're in too deep. They forgot what they were there for. I mean, that's a real phenomenon, right? Also, if you're on the inside, you may become ostracized from those on the outside that should be your allies. And that may be your fault, maybe their fault. Again, whatever. I'm just saying that may happen. There may be this divide that occurs between you and those that are on the outside. All right, let's talk about those that are on the outside. They're employing these more external strategies. So if they're outside the system, first of all, they may be outside the system now, but were they once inside? And if that's true, do they even consider themselves an outsider, or do they still consider themselves an insider, even though they're now outside? Maybe they don't see themselves as an outsider. Maybe they see themselves as being on the outside, but trying to employ inside strategies. I think that occurs as well. But anyway, what we're talking about here is someone who is consciously employing, or should be employing consciously, knowing what they're doing, an outside strategy. So they are likely to be less constrained in what they can say and what they can do. I'll just use myself as an example. I'm no longer in the military. I can criticize the military as openly as I want. I can say whatever I want. And the things that I say about the military, I feel are true. I'm not just like, making up stuff to make up stuff, but I can say that because I'm no longer in the military. I'm far less constrained. I can speak more freely. Now I can say a bunch of stuff that I don't believe, or stuff that it's just preposterous. I don't think I really do that. But even just within the realm of what I believe to be true, I'm much freer in my ability to speak openly, less constrained. But because I'm outside, and I'm just using myself as an example, which I probably shouldn't even do. But if you're outside, you may be more removed from the problem. There may be information that you don't receive at all, or you don't receive it in a timely manner, or when you do receive it, it comes through some sort of filter that kind of colors that information, so that of course can happen. So those are some of the opportunities. You could speak more freely, you're less constrained, but then you also got to understand there's some risk associated with that. The information that you get may not be as accurate, or it may have gone through some sort of filter that may change that information, or color that information in some way. You're further away from the problem, you may miss the good things. So if the guys on the inside are so close that they may miss the bad things within the system, you may be so far away, and you may just have this perception towards the system that everything is bad, and so you're missing some of the good things that may come out, that some of the people within the system do, or that the system itself does. Also, you may lose all vested interest that you had in the system, even if you were once within it, and you may kind of cut it off, and then you may become ostracized from those that are still within. So kind of the inverse of what I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that could happen in the other direction. So, you got to be careful, whether you're on the inside or whether you're on the outside. You do have to be careful as to how things can be, how you might perceive things compared to the way that other individuals might perceive things. Now, here's the deal. It kind of like, it doesn't end there, because here's what else I would say, right? So if you are on the inside, okay, you got to be careful. You can't be naive, and you can't lie. I mean, again, these are my opinions, but this is what I say. Don't be naive. Don't lie. I don't think that's too much to ask. But you may need to be strategically judicious in what you say, when, and how you say it. Okay. I'm gonna repeat that, right? So if you're on the inside and you're employing an inside strategy, that does not give you a license to, be naive or to lie. Now, I kind of mentioned like spies and espionage and undercover agents earlier. Those would be extreme cases. I mean, do you have to tell lies if you're a spy, or, obviously you have to have an entire cover story or whatever. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. We're not going that extreme. As a general rule, if you're playing an inside strategy, you, you shouldn't be openly lying, but I certainly understand how you may have to be very prudent in what you say, when, and how. That I totally get. You can't necessarily be as open or as confrontational as you could if you're on the outside. I think that's understandable to some degree. I don't think you have a license to take that too far, though. At the same time, if you're on the outside and you're operating in this external environment, external to the system, you don't want to get caught up in just discounting out of hand everything that either the system does as a system, in the collective, or that the people who are part of that system may do. Because now you may be throwing out the good with everything else, and a lot of our systems or institutions here in the United States, whether it's the military, other government departments, or whatever, the institutions have become corrupted. They've become, I would say, the big three, right? They've become perverted, subverted, and inverted. And I think that's very, very true. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they started out that way. Some of them probably did, but a lot of them did not. So that this perversion, subversion, and inversion has happened over time. And in theory, it could be reversed. Now, it would take a lot to reverse that, and we don't necessarily need to explore that here in this video, but it could be, which means that we could try to find the good in these systems, and the good people that are in these systems, and the good things that can be salvaged. So, you might listen to this and you might say, well, maybe I could find a middle ground between an inside and an outside strategy. Cool, great, whatever. Like I said, it may not always be exactly cut and dried as to who is inside, who is outside, or whatever. But I do think that at least trying to frame it that way in our minds might help us understand why some people act a little bit differently than we do. So, I'm not going to talk about the Bobby Kennedy situation, but I do think that at least that there is a good case of trying to understand, is someone trying to employ an inside strategy? Do they have to act differently? Is that permissible? Or what is permissible? So you might say, hey, I understand that someone who's on the inside can't act or speak exactly the same as someone who is on the outside. Okay, so we might both agree with that, but then we might have to say, what is permissible? And that's why I kind of said, hey, I'll tell you my opinion. You can't be naive. Now, I realize that when you are naive, you don't mean to be naive. I get that. But what I'm saying is that if some is, I think it's okay to criticize someone who you think is employing an inside strategy, but looks to be naive. Because if you're naive and you're on the inside, you will not employ your strategy nearly as effectively as you think you will. You'll become part of the system in a way that maybe you didn't intend to, and like I said, there are plenty of risks that come with being on the outside too. Now, if you're on the outside, because if you're on the outside, it's easy to know who's playing an outside strategy. The inside strategy, to some degree, is more complex and very tricky. So, I mean, again, using espionage as an example, that's not exactly what we're talking about here, but I mean, there are some parallels, but think about how complex the game of espionage is. I mean, like if you read spy novels, I have said before, I think more Americans should read old spy novels or watch old spy movies, because that's the way the world really works. It really is, even within our own government or whatever. But it's still espionage. It's still massive, very sophisticated deception campaigns, etc. But here's the trick with an inside strategy. So you see someone and you say, is that person employing an inside strategy, or are they part of the system? And that can be very hard to know if you're looking at someone else and you're trying to figure it out. Because I will tell you, and there's risk in this when you are looking at someone else and you are trying to determine what their actions are or the integrity of their actions. Because here's the trick. Um, if someone is employing an inside strategy, they've got to gain common ground with other people in the system. Okay, nothing wrong with that. If they want to carry out change, they've got to start with the low hanging fruit. Everyone's been talking about this, whether it's with the Maha movement or whatever. Everyone's talked about this. Everyone understands. Maybe not everyone understands, but many people at least understand. You may not be able to go for the big items first. Okay. You got to work your way up to that. Okay. So let's just assume that people may accept the validity of that idea. Here's the problem, though, is that if you start with the low-hanging fruit, in the beginning, that type of a strategy, starting with the low-hanging fruit, in the beginning will look exactly like a limited hangout. Why? Because at least in the beginning, there's no way to know as to whether or not you're starting with the low-hanging fruit and you're eventually going to get to the bigger items, or if it's just a limited hangout, are you starting with the low-hanging fruit and you're just kind of giving something to the masses to appease them, or you're just trying to get some victories, but then it's going to stop. It's just, it's a limited hangout, or it's a controlled disclosure of information or whatever. So what I'm saying is in the beginning, a true strategy that starts with the low-hanging fruit, but will eventually get to the much bigger ticket items, will look exactly like a limited hangout. The difference is, they both may go here, but then one will keep going to the bigger ticket items, But in the beginning, it may be very, very hard to see the difference. So there's some risk there in understanding that strategy of starting with the low-hanging fruit will look like a limited hangout in the very beginning, or at least it can. So should you start with the bigger ticket items? Well, I mean, sometimes that can be harder to pull off, So anyway, I think I'm just rambling here, so probably time to end this video. So in summation, this is something that I've been thinking about recently, just trying to understand, hey, why are these strategies different? Do they have to be different? And I think, yeah, they do, or they often can be. And it's important for us to understand that, because my perspective, where I stand, may be different than someone else's perspective. And they may be employing a different strategy. The problem is, so few people even understand their own actions or what their own strategy is, because they don't have one, that if they don't even understand what their own strategy is because they don't have one, how can they understand someone else's strategy when in all likelihood that other person also doesn't have one? But there are plenty of people that do. There are plenty of people that do know what they're doing. They understand their environment, at least somewhat, and they have some sort of idea as to how they want to get from where they are to where they want to go. And you may look at that and you may not understand exactly what or why that person is doing what they're doing, but there may actually be a reason for it. So I hope this was helpful. You guys, let me know below. Again, this has been just a quick discussion on internal versus external strategies, or inside versus outside strategies. I hope this was helpful. You guys let me know what your thoughts are, and I'll see you next time. I appreciate it.